or the Growing Alabama particularly well because it's hard to figure out how to adequately put those in the spreadsheet. So here's what we did. We said, look, there's three major parts where Alabama is spending its money from the, or providing the credit from the Jobs Act. I'm Growing Alabama, I'm sorry. First is site development. It's important to note that every state has some sort of an incentive for site development, every single solitary one. A few examples, you have as low as Kentucky being $500,000 per project. You have North Carolina being 12,500 for each projected job saved or won. That can be a significant amount of money. And then you have Tennessee, who has been uber aggressive. Tennessee, for the most recent Ford truck plant, Tennessee bought the property, developed the property, and will maintain the property. That's as aggressive as we've seen from any state. The other thing are startup and accelerators. Most states offer incentives for startup companies, and we're not any different, although you know, I know the Innovation Corporation is still looking at other ways to provide the kind of programs to help those companies prosper more aggressively. Most states do fund innovation-related program. Most states fund the innovation-related programs to support startups like accelerators, incubators, those kind of things, but they don't offer that with a credit for the EDOs. They don't offer anything like the Jobs Act. I'm sorry, Growing Alabama. What they do is typically a direct investment into those programs. Let me say this before I leave that part. I completely identify with Secretary Canfield last time when he said, we cannot do an ROI on accelerators because the programs are 3 years old, the companies are so new. How in the world can we estimate what will happen going forward? I think that's exactly right. I couldn't either. But I will offer you one proxy for why these types of companies are important, not necessarily for today's conversation, but for future conversations, if you look at the Alabama Launchpad, which is a business plan competition that we've run at EDPA for 16 years, where seed stage companies and concept stage companies win money. So if you had asked me 3 years in to do an ROI on that program, I would have had the same exact answer that Secretary Canfield had in our first meeting. But now looking at it 16 years in our rearview mirror, there have been 104 winners. 66% of those companies are still in existence. They collectively employ more than 2,800 people, and their valuation of the companies collectively is north of $800 million. So the programs work. They're just going to be longer term. That I know that's not a conversation for today, but it is a conversation down the road, and that's a good proxy for that. And then finally, support services for underserved markets. Most states do incentivize underserved companies and communities. Candidly, there's advantages in our program for underserved communities and companies. So, you know, Alabama's not any different. But what they don't do is incentivize the programs that support those companies. It's just they will make cash investments from the state sometimes, but they don't have any kind of transferable credit like that. So that's a quick overview. I mean, you got a feel for the fact that from a tax perspective, through the lens of the kind of companies that we selected, of our competitiveness, you got an idea about, you know, the value of the incentives that are expiring. Happy to take any questions about anything that I said. If there's questions about anything that I didn't say, I'd be happy to try to address those related to incentives as well.
All right. Any of the members have questions? All right. Representative Garrett.
Thank you, Governor. Just two questions. One is, the first is sort of technical, but you mentioned several times the corporate tax rate being a disadvantage. Do your calculations include our statutory corporate tax rate, or are you taking into account that we allow the federal income tax deduction to have a lower effective rate?
We use the effective rate. We use the effective rate taking into account our federal deduction.
Okay. And the second is that if I read these charts correctly, in all of these, we look to be one of the top 2 or 3 in terms of overall tax burden when you put them all together. Do you understand why when various publications look at business climate, we do not come that high up, even though because they weight taxes different. There are other factors. Do you know why our business climate index is lower than what this shows?
Yeah, I'm familiar with one or two of those. So the one or two that I'm familiar with is they look at other taxes that we considered. So we looked at corporate income tax, property tax for the company, and we looked property tax for the company, income tax for the company, and sales tax for the company. A lot of those others look at for individuals. You know, do you tax groceries? What is your sales tax rate for individuals? What's your property tax rate for individuals?
Okay.
So they're typically broader comparisons.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to go back to the support for service for underserved markets. And most of my district is one of those underserved markets that I live in. What are your advice? And I understand that you made your statement that most states incentivize underserved companies, but do not incentivize programs to support them. What programs do you see that we have that need more support in order to support those underserved markets?
So I think that we need to. I mean, I don't want to get into your recommendations, but is it fair to say you would want to continue to support the companies that are in the?
Sure. I just want an answer. I don't care where it come from.
We at Commerce were big proponents of ramping up our attention on underserved.
Correct.
Not only companies, but also underserved communities. What we've noticed through the EDPA analysis is that relative to other states, most other states they don't accomplish that goal through a credit program like Growing Alabama. They do it through a mechanism of straightforward grants.
Okay.
Right? And so that's different than what we do with Growing Alabama. It's a different way to do it. The new Alabama Innovation Corporation is likely a vehicle which could, if properly funded, be able to take over those types of grant opportunities when serving an underserved community is tied to technology or to entrepreneurship, the development of early stage companies. We see Commerce as more of a continuum. You take an early stage company from infancy and you help it grow and flourish through a modest grant program that they have to qualify for. In the case of Launchpad at EDPA, they're competing. But through an accelerator program, that accelerator program is also having applications for companies to participate, and they select in a competition of sorts the companies that are most likely to be able to be positively impacted through those accelerators. All that I think can continue, but we believe that Commerce best comes into play after those companies begin to grow, reinvest, and add new employees. And once they get to a certain size, the Alabama Jobs Act can come in. And we passed, with the help of the legislature last year, the Jobs Act was tweaked so that we have bonus add-on incentives to properly incentivize underserved companies. We don't really want to change that.
Well, I really appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And the problem that I have is that when we go through the Job Act, we all agree that we want to do something for rural communities, we want to do something for underserved communities. It's that next step where he's talking about what do we do to make it happen. And it's okay to have it on the books, but what are we doing for the next step? And as you're saying, if there are not incentives out there to bring on that next step, and if it has to be done through a grant, then we need to know that versus something else that we need to be doing. I don't just want it on the books and it looks cute and we're saying we're doing it and it's not happening. And I'm more about what happens at the next step. So I want to be able to work with you or whoever, EDPA or to whomever it is, to make that next step happen. And we got it on the books, but it's not happening. Thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions? All right, Director Poole.
Thanks, Mr. Governor. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you okay.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for not being there in person today. I just wanted to make an observation and maybe a question. One is particularly as related to Mr. Barker's comment about the launchpad companies. I would assume it's accurate to say those, I forget the number, 66 or whatever, however many companies, those are all Alabama companies, right? And so they've remained in Alabama, at least a high percentage, and remained headquartered in Alabama. And I think that's an important point. And then I would just say, and I'll make my points and then go back on mute. I think what we're seeing is a validation as it relates to growing in jobs that incentive thematic is very competitive. But I want to, and I think that is a huge part of our economic development puzzle. But I just want to challenge the commission to remember within the context of all of these discussions that we also need to be considering where are the gaps, what are other activities from an economic development standpoint that are growth activities that we also need to focus on, because these are by and large, particularly the examples that Mr. Barker laid out, are large, multinational for the most part type of manufacturing and industrial investment. And we need to be cognizant, and I think within the mission of this entity, think about, okay, are we adequately addressing other economic sectors, whether those are medium-sized businesses, Alabama businesses, and I'm not sure what those all are, but I think we're validating growth in jobs is very competitive and is very important. But I think we need to be mindful that we've got to look beyond that into the other segments of our communities, our state, and our economy to make sure we're also thinking forward. And I don't know what all those answers are. I just note for the committee that I think that's part of our challenge is to look beyond growing in jobs as well into other areas. And I certainly thank you for the opportunity to make a few comments. Thank you.
Just for clarification, Director Poole's assumption about are they companies that are in Alabama, headquartered Alabama, stayed in Alabama, the answer is yes. And it's also clear from our research that it's not an either or for states. They're not saying, should we support the kind of companies that we've outlined, or should we support emerging companies and entrepreneurs? It's an and. States are doing both.
All right. Anyone else have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Greg. Appreciate your presentation, your work. All right, next I want to turn it over to Secretary Canfield and his staff.
First of all, let me thank everyone. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, the commission. Certainly appreciate the work that EDPA has done looking at kind of where Alabama stacks up. It's an interesting world, right? If we didn't have to have incentives, there was no world with incentives, we could stack up pretty good. But at the end of the day, the reality is that states are using incentives every day. Without the use of the Alabama Jobs Act, we would not be able to be as competitive. And I think one of the takeaways that we have in all of this is that we have never desired to have a toolbox of incentives that was able to give the most money away in terms of incentives. We wanted a toolbox that created wealth for the state, that helped raise the level of wage earning capability for Alabama citizens. And we wanted to do so in a way that we wanted to have a toolbox that was sustainable and profitable and pay as you go. And I think hopefully based on the first presentation that we did in the first meeting, this commission had an opportunity to see actual data rather than just projections, which is what we have been using leading up to this, and the actual data is kind of proving out much of that. So let me get into a set of recommendations that we're making. I want to point out too, as we looked at this, we didn't want to make a set of recommendations in a vacuum. So we reached out to EDAA, the Economic Development Association of Alabama, and want to thank Jim Searcy and his organization for putting together a group, a representative group. Both small, rural, as well as large municipal economic development communities were represented in this, Black Belt communities, everybody. We also have been working with EDPA, our utility partners. We have reached out to and had feedback from relative to reaching these recommendations today. Rural-facing organizations we've reached out to about this. Our company executives from around the state we've talked to, consultants have been spoken to about this. We've worked through our Office of Small Business to make sure that we've got some ability. You know, we're not really targeting small businesses from an incentive perspective in a real direct, robust way today. But we do have some programs that have helped to some extent. But the calling for commerce has never been one that statutorily granted us much room to operate in the entrepreneurial small business arena, particularly at the micro level of small business. All of this feedback, though, has helped us reach some conclusions that really we want to just refresh our incentive components, and we want to revisit the existing sunset and caps. So when we look at the Alabama Jobs Act first, that program sunset July 31st, 2023. We've got a cap that we have in that program of $350 million on an annualized balance, which means, all that means is that when we make a commitment today, we enter into a project agreement regarding those incentives. And of course, we count that against the cap. But we also have to count, because we have to encumber against the cap, any obligations that we have outstanding offers to companies to make certain that the state can stand by and meet the obligations under the cap. So I'm here to say that we are bumping up close to the cap. So we certainly are going to need to revisit that cap and have recommendations in that regard. So as we go into, and just as a refresher on that Alabama Jobs Act, we're focused on the goals of stimulating new capital investment and new job creation. When these incentives were first created back in 2015, we had a minimum threshold to incentivize companies that was passed in that legislation that created a minimum threshold of 50 jobs. We've been able to tweak that down to smaller numbers in certain circumstances, and in some cases it's almost zero for new innovation technology driven companies. So we've got some flexibility. You've helped us evolve this application of these incentives over time, and certainly in the data that we've seen, it's helped us achieve some good results. So the other goal is to generate net new revenue flows. And I think certainly the data that we were able to provide to you in our first meeting showed that that was positively impacting per capita wages for Alabamians. In other words, we want to raise the wage rate for Alabamians through the Alabama Jobs Act. And again, I think the data that we were able to show you showed that was. We really have been focusing a lot on a rural strategy to take and to develop real opportunities in rural Alabama, and it has been working. I want to refresh your memory there. In 2021, we successfully recruited or worked with existing industry to expand, to attract $7.7 billion of new investment in our state. Well, $3.6 billion objective that we all have to grow opportunities in rural Alabama. And from that, when we focused on the jobs being created within investment, it's about 10,200 jobs in 2021 coming from that 7.6. Alabama, that job creation is about 3,600 jobs. So out of the 10,200, about 3,600 jobs are coming to rural Alabama. I want to remind you, in using incentives as investment tools, are creating a performance-based system that is pay-as-you-go. We are generating net new revenue flows to the state from the company, but also from the employee. We go to slide, I guess I need to give you the slide number. So we go to slide number 4. This goes to the information with the chart about the median wage comparison. I'll just refresh your memory. The median wage in 2021 for the average Alabama was $17.91. Our projections from actual project agreements in place was that we were going to achieve a wage rate that was $19.23, about 7% above the median wage in 2021. Our actual project wage, which was based on actual performance, is 31% above the median wage. We actually achieved $23.44 using the Jobs Act incentives, and that's a real number based on real data. So we are accomplishing one of our big goals, and that is to help raise the level of wages of Alabamians. We go to
Question before you leave that.
Yes, sir.
I just want a clear understanding. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. So you're telling me that based on incentives that we're giving companies, this is the average wage that we're asking those companies will receive incentives from the state of Alabama?
Senator Singleton, what that $23.44 came from is actual compliance data.
Gotcha. Okay.
And we expected it to be $19.23.
So it exceeded what you were looking for.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome.
I mean, kind of tickled about it.
Thank you.
I wish that, we're going to monitor that throughout the life cycle of these incentives too. So I'm frozen.
Lieutenant Governor has jokes. I'm sorry.
Shake it. Oh, there you go. I just needed, it is, or it was. Is that better?
Can you hear me? There we go. So that gets us to the return on incentives, and this actually comes in slide 5 in your packet. The actual performance of the Jobs Act far exceeded our estimates in those real numbers. And how do I get rid of, there we go, thank you. We estimated gross state revenues to be about $164,600,000. The actual gross state revenue is $256,800,000 plus. The Jobs Act incentives, we expected to be $100 million plus. We actually came in at just under $96 million. And the net revenue to the state, we far exceeded that expectation. Our estimate was that we would have a return on this is a return on incentives. I keep falsely saying return on investment. This is a return on the actual incentives. So we expected a 64% return, and we actually achieved in the real data 168% return on those investments. So we're charged to be revenue positive. So our desire to build positive net revenue flows to the states has been achieved in the use of the Alabama Jobs Act incentives. EDPA's presentation was interesting because when you looked at the company's ROI, their return on investment, you'll see that companies are making investments, putting their capital at risk, expecting much lower actual returns on investment. And we're exceeding those types of ROIs based on our investment using incentives. So,
Secretary Canfield, real quick, Representative Garrett had a question.
Yeah, just one thing. I asked you about this before the last time we meet. I understand the math is correct. I'm not challenging the calculation. Sure. I still am skeptical of that return. Just wanted to say that again. Maybe we can visit more about that.
Yeah, we can sit down and show you how we calculate it. So happy to do that. So we go to slide 6, which is moving into our recommendations. And again, I got a pop-up window. There we go. The first is on the sunset is to take that current sunset with and add a 5-year extension to go out to 7/31 of 2028. That would extend it, again, just for 5 years. Why 5 years? A lot of the negotiating that we do with projects is 2 or 3 years in the making. The longer we go down that timeline, this last time we had a 3-year sunset extension. As we get closer to that 3-year period, it sometimes gets a little problematic in terms of being able to assure companies that we're negotiating with that we're going to be able to have these incentives by the time we get to project agreement time. So, and we think the data actually helps back up the fact that we can afford to go to a longer sunset. Nothing prohibits the legislature from taking action on any of these incentives before that date anyway. So, if something were to change and we wanted to come back and revisit those incentives, that sunset date does not prevent the legislature from doing so. Also, we wanted to make sure that as we look at the cap today, we believe we have proven through the data that we have a true pay-as-you-go system. In other words, as a pay-as-you-go system, that cap really doesn't play a purpose except to restrict what we can do in terms of trying to attract new investment into the state. But because it's pay-as-you-go, we're not paying incentives to any company that does not perform in the previous 12-month cycle. So the way that the Jobs Act incentives work, a company has to make their investment that they've agreed to. That's the first hurdle. They have to go into operation and commence operations by a date certain that's also stipulated in the contract. And they have a ramp-up period of time stipulated in the project agreement, the contract, that stipulates how they're going to add jobs. It commits to a project average wage as part of that contract, and it commits to benefits being paid to each of those employees, and we only incentivize also on Alabama workers. So if they do not perform in the previous 12 months, they do not get those incentives. As an example, we still, and we had data that we showed you this in the last meeting, we have a number of companies who we consider non-compliant. In other words, there's some aspect of their operation that they did not meet a milestone within the project agreement, and we did not have to pay them incentives for that prior year. Yet the state still gets the full revenue. So there's no way for the Jobs Act incentives to make a incentive payment that the company has not created positive revenue flows to the state first before those incentives are paid. So we would argue that a Jobs Act cap really is not necessary, particularly given the fact that the legislature has a sunset and can always take legislative action on any incentive at any time in a session.
Secretary Canfield, quick question. So you said earlier we're bumping up close to the cap, correct?
That's correct.
How close are we to that? Do you know that?
That changes every day because we adjust against that cap based on wins and losses, as well as project agreements that are finalized. We are within, what, 20 million? 25 million?
And are y'all not going after companies because the ability's not there because of the?
We're modifying our offers.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's important for the commission to understand, right?
I mean, we are modifying our offers because we have to take that into consideration against the cap.
Let me ask you this. If the cap was removed, what do you think would be the real number in Alabama that we would be at? I mean, in the next 5 years, right? I mean, where do you think we'd be on that?
So we believe that there's an equilibrium that we will eventually reach. In other words, what I mean by that is the number of new incentives that will be coming online at some point will equal the incentives that are coming offline as those incentive payouts and the project agreements are exhausted and terminated. We don't really know. I wish I could tell you that we know what that number is. If I were to guess, I would be just guessing, but I would expect that we're talking about somewhere above the half $500 million range.
Okay.
So, but that's a guess.
Sure.
But the main thing is these are revenues and incentives being paid out of new revenues as the revenue's flowing. So we're not taking anything out of current revenue flows. Nothing's coming out of the education or the general fund budget without revenues first coming into the state to cover it. So when we move on to the next slide, that next slide is slide 7. And we're looking at here kind of tweaking to make the language in the Jobs Act make more sense. We want to remove the term leasing company from the law because we want it out to clarify the fact that we've got a policy. We don't incentivize leased or temp employees today. So we don't count a temp employee and we don't incentivize in the payroll incentive any temp employee. And so the term leasing company existing there doesn't make sense. So we want to remove that. The other thing that exists is in the investment credit, which is part of the Jobs Act, that tax credit and the credit against utilities taxes can be taken by related companies under the law. But the law doesn't stipulate what the ownership is, the ownership requirements are to be eligible to be considered a related company. Our practice at Commerce has been that in order to be considered a related company, that related company has to be at least 50+% owned by the incentivized parent company. And we just want to put that into the statute so that it's clear when we're negotiating with companies. That lack of clarity creates a problem when we're negotiating sometimes.
Mr. Chairman.
Rosemary, go ahead.
Secretary Canfield,
Yes.
on the leased or temporary employees, what you want to do is take that out of the incentive packages, but it would not prohibit a company from hiring leased or temporary
No.
employees in a ramp-up situation where they need to quickly manufacture something.
That's correct. And our practice today is just that. I mean, I know that Senator Singleton and I have had a conversation a couple of years ago. I don't even know if he remembers it. He was concerned that one of the automotive companies was being paid incentives for temps that they were hiring during a ramp up, but we don't. So we still allow them to be used because the company's got that right under the law. but we're not incentivizing them, nor do we count them against the head count as part of their job satisfaction requirements. So, but they're perfectly willing, they're perfectly able to do that. We won't change that.
Thank you.
The next slide is slide 8, and we have something that was incorporated into the Jobs Act when we first passed it in 2015. This really centered around the project that currently today operates as OWA. Back then, it wasn't going to be OWA. It was going to be something else. And so this language was dropped in the legislative session, not at the request of Commerce. And we're not a tourism agency. We think it ought to come out. And the reason we think it ought to come out is, one, we believe that it's better served to be addressed in the Department of Tourism. But we also don't think that these projects merit Jobs Act incentives. Why? Because they're generally low-wage, seasonal, and part-time jobs that are associated with them. Most are heavily weighted with a retail component, which we have no statutory authority as an agency to incentivize retail, except under this little provision. And it's also difficult because of the low wages, part-time jobs, and temp jobs for us to use Jobs Act incentives and to be revenue positive to the state. Most projects in this category are also not what we would consider to be competitive. In other words, we're not typically competing against other states for these types of projects. And as you know, we work really hard not to incentivize companies where we're not competing with another state. If we're not competing, no need to incentivize with Jobs Act incentives. And so with those tourism destinations, we believe that we should remove them and allow them to be treated differently in another agency or through another tool. That's one of the things we feel pretty strongly about. The transferability is an investment credit feature that in the law today allows us to grant up to a 3-year transferability of the first 3 years of the investment credit. It allows a company to monetize that tax credit by selling that tax credit to another taxpayer. It doesn't change the amount of tax credit. It doesn't change the liability of the state on that tax credit, but it does allow a company to create monetization in a very good way, because we're not having to use Amendment 666 to borrow funds as heavily, because we can monetize it. We've got the numbers and the data that show that that transferability has actually helped us close those projects. We believe that taking the transferability to a 5-year limit would also give us the ability to close more deals, to be able to have those companies monetize the first 5 years of the investment credit is something that it would not have any impact on positive revenue flows. It doesn't impact the return on our incentives. It's just a smart way to create money without borrowing it for the state. So that's one of the things that we would like to see in our recommendations. And then finally, some cleanup items. These are slide 9. We want to tighten up some confidentiality issues to protect trade information that's confidential when companies make their applications to Commerce, as well as when they send in their compliance reports. They're sharing with us data that can personally identify people. They're giving us data that we don't want to share with anybody. So we want to protect that and codify it in the statute. We also want to allow Revenue and Commerce to share information and be able to disclose tax information one with the other only for the purposes of administering the incentives. So we want to create language that creates a tight, narrowly defined type of information that can be shared that must continue to be protected by law, just as it is today. We also want to make certain that we streamline the investment credit transfer process. Today, it's kind of cumbersome. It requires 3 processes. Every one of these transfers really ultimately requires the governor's approval. So we want to streamline it just to the normal approval process of getting and going to the governor for approval. It will make it faster. It'll reduce the cost burden on the companies that are selling the credit and the companies that are buying the credit. It's more business friendly to do that. All right, that's the end of the Jobs Act, and I'll promise you that I'm not going to spend as much time on growing Alabama, so I know you've been in your seats for a while. Any questions from what we've presented so far?
I do have one question. So rural's come up a bunch today. What is Commerce's definition of rural when you mention that?
Okay, so the legislation, we went back and forth a lot during the legislative session about what rural would be. Today, we've identified rural as targeted and jumpstart counties. So a targeted county today is any county in Alabama that has a population under 50,000. A jumpstart county is any county that has negative population growth or fewer than 2 opportunity zones. Is that right? And. So there's an and in there. So that's the definition today of rural. So we can all argue whether that's really rural or not, but that's the definition that we're working under today.
All right. Any other members have any questions? Alabama Jobs Act?
I have one. So I think I asked this question the last time. Do we have any information as far as the time span between your entering into an agreement and credits beginning to be claimed? Is it 3? Is it 5? I mean, how many years?
Like an average?
Average.
I don't know that I have that off the top of my head, but we can certainly get that. It's pretty easy to get to.
Okay.
If I were to guess, do you want me to guess? I mean, it's a swag, but I would say that the typical time period from the time we execute a project agreement to we pay out the first incentive is 3 to 4 years.
And can y'all get that data for Kirk? Would that be possible? All right.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions?
Which actually gives us a lot of time for budgeting, right? I mean, that's one of the things we want to do. All right, growing Alabama. So the purpose for growing Alabama this is in slide number 12, slide 12. The purpose is to be the incentive mechanism that provides a source of funds for EDO is an economic development organization. So that's what an EDO is, like your local IDB board, IDA board, county commission, city council, those kinds of things. And to stimulate economic growth for qualifying projects. When we first did this, it was about land. This was about taking land that had been held out for economic development and needed improvements through infrastructure or site improvements or surrounding road or whatever construction to make it more marketable so that we could attract more projects to these sites. Our annual cap in this program is $20 million, and it sunsets also on July 31st of 2023. The use of these funds and actual practicality is shown on slide 13. This chart shows you the number of applications that we've had for different qualifying categories. So we've had 36 total applications with requests for funding of $83,754,000, and we've been able to allocate funds based on our cap of $67,616,000. 22 of those applications have been for site prep and public infrastructure improvements. 1 has been for an intermodal facility or an inland port. 10 have been for tech accelerators. 2 have been for underrepresented companies. So just remember that underrepresented companies were added in the 2021 session.
Define that, underrepresented companies.
You know, the legislature helped us define that. And
Refresh my.
Senator Singleton, I don't have that definition.
Okay.
Do we have that definition? No, underrepresented.
Underrepresented companies.
It has a minority and a women-owned component. Senator Singleton, the
But that is
definition
so
actually,
important. Y'all don't even remember it. That's so sad. It's important. That means that somebody's not paying attention to that much.
no, that's not the case. I mean, it's just the definition is a kind of a long definition.
Okay.
And it actually mirrors, Senator Singleton, it actually mirrors the definition that came out of the purchasing
Right.
group.
Right.
Yeah. So we use that definition.
Same. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, sir.
That was a good one.
Yeah. And I apologize.
No problems.
I'm an old guy now.
You ain't
I
older than
don't
I
remember
am.
stuff as I used
You
to.
ain't older than I am. We're good.
Would that also include veteran-owned businesses?
So veteran-owned businesses are not part of that, but we have actually some benefits, some incentives that target the hiring of veterans.
But not a veteran-owned business.
There are some incentives on the books, but they're not part of our Jobs Act incentives. Heroes for Hire is not one of them. So the next slide is slide 14, which is the return on the Growing Alabama. And you'll see these are returns that are categorized based on site prep, intermodal, tech accelerators, and programs for underrepresented companies. So clearly, site prep has a high accelerators and programs for underrepresented companies have negative returns. It's only because these are everything above tech accelerators is based on capital expenditures. And we're talking about using a credit program. The use of a credit program for tech accelerators in this case and for programs for underrepresented companies are using a credit-based system, which is not conducive to creating a positive return like a grant system would. And so our recommendation out of this really is we need to be looking more closely at the operation and the capabilities and the funding for programs and coverage of programs through the Alabama Innovation Corporation. We think that that's a perfect opportunity for us to take some of that into consideration, particularly as it relates to tech accelerators and program expenses for underrepresented companies. Capital expense for underrepresented companies, the credit program can work well for. So when we go down to our recommendations, we want to take that sunset again and extend it for 5 years. The $20 million cap, we want to increase to $35 million. And that also means for the rural component here, we've got to set aside that for the first 6 months, we set aside 25% of the cap for Growing Alabama. So today at $20 million cap, that set aside for the first 6 months reserves $5 million for the use in rural Alabama. That 25% with a $35 million cap would go to $8,750,000. And we don't want to change that. We think that's a good proportion for rural development as we move through time. The next slide, slide 16, is where we kind of get into some of the discussion and the points that were covered and that came out of the EDPA study. We believe that accelerators and their operational activities should not be eligible under Growing Alabama. They should be covered under grants from the Alabama Innovation Corporation. There's been a good deal of conversation about that, and while we don't have anything in writing, I think there's collectively a good bit of support to see the Innovation Corporation move in that direction, because accelerators are working with small, innovative companies and in entrepreneurial settings. And that's really the reason this particular corporation is being created, and we want to support that. There is another component that deals with a definition for agricultural centers, and we want to make sure that we align agricultural centers eligibility more closely with industrial site eligibility. We've been talking to the ag community about this, and we've got an agreement in principle on what this might look like. So as we look at this, basically all we're talking about doing is, again, removing operational cost and expenses out of being eligible for this. But the hard cost of site improvement and the construction and the leasing of an ag center as it's defined in the law, which we won't change, should be able to be covered in the credit. And I think we've got general agreement. And there's a project moving around the state right now in that regard, and we want to support it. Any questions? That kind of concludes what we want to do with the Growing Alabama credit.
All right. Any questions? All right. So, Representative Garrett.
Are we able to get information on the Jobs Act credits by county?
Yes. Yeah.
The geographic distribution of those credits?
Yeah.
Can we get that information?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
All right. Anyone else?
You also want to see how we compute that return on incentive. Okay. Anything else?
All right. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Does anybody else on the commission have anything? If not, let's kind of go over what we've done so far, right? And Secretary Canfield, let me say this. I just want to thank you personally and, as only statewide elected official here on behalf of Alabama for what you've done for our state. I mean, I think when you look at Alabama, the fact that industries, no matter where I go in this country, people are impressed with what's going on here. Companies want to move here. And a big part of that is the work that you and your team do at Commerce. So I just want to say thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your leadership. Let's give him a round of applause for what you do. Thank you so much. Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, the legislature is going to be part of that team.
Yeah. And we're going to continue to do that. So thinking through where we've been through, right? First, we talked about where we've been, and Department of Commerce laid that out. Then today, had Greg Barker talk about, where we are. And I'll say this, looking at that, we're in a good spot. Obviously, there's some things that need to be tweaked. And then I thought it was appropriate to have Department of Commerce. They're the experts. They're doing this day in, day out. What better group to talk about what we need to do than the people that are doing that and already doing a good job? But with that, I want you to take this study that you've got, go back and talk with your groups. If you're in the Senate or House, certainly talk to your colleagues. If you're a member of a different trade organization, talk to them and find out what other recommendations, y'all might have or things that need to be tweaked. Some good things were brought up today. I certainly think from the cap standpoint, it certainly needs to look at being raised. I think when you look at that, we're bumping up against that. We're limiting Alabama to other states. And so I think, but look through those recommendations. What I'd like for you to do, our staff's going to reach out to each of y'all. We want to hear what those are. And then the goal is at the next meeting, which will probably be the end of October, to try to have a list of recommendations that this group can agree on and get legislation to present to the legislature next time. So that's kind of where we've been. And so any other questions or thoughts before we adjourn? Okay. With that, I need a motion, a second to adjourn. All right. Got a motion? Second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All right. Any opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you so much for your time.